How many wars can planet Earth survive? War has been part of life for pretty much as long as life has been around. For some reason, humans and fighting seems to go hand in hand. In fact, I'd bet you would be pretty hard pressed to find any year in the last 2000 where there wasn't at least some tiny war skirmish going on in some part of the world. Wars are obviously pretty horrible and extremely damaging to human life. It's currently estimated that war, throughout all of human history, has claimed the lives of anywhere from 150 million to a billion people. That is a lot of people who have died for what most of the time works out to be something really stupid. So there's no denying that war is clearly pretty bad for humans as a whole. It's also really bad for the planet as well though. Climate change and greenhouse gas emissions have been something that the planet Earth is struggling with for the last few decades. We are only beginning to understand how truly detrimental climate change is to our future and the future of the planet. We're also only just scratching the surface of what needs to be done in regards to changing things so that our world going up in flames doesn't become an actual reality. War, as you can probably imagine, is not the best thing for the environment or the planet. In fact, war is right up there as being one of the most costly things for our environment. So, with that being considered, how many wars can planet Earth actually take? Well, the truth behind it is that the actual conflict in war is just one element to how much it can damage the planet. There are also other aspects of this question that we need to consider as well. Conflict and Environment Observatory says, the environmental impact of wars begins long before they do. Building and sustaining military forces consumes vast quantities of resources. These might be common metals or rare earth elements, water or hydrocarbons. Maintaining military readiness means training, and training consumes resources. Military vehicles, aircraft, vessels, buildings, and infrastructure all require energy, and more often than not, that energy is oil and energy efficiency is low. The CO2 emissions of the largest militaries are greater than many of the world's countries combined. So, with that being considered, it's not just the conflict itself, but it's the preparation to the conflict that causes serious damaging effects. There is a war going on right now in Europe. But before the first soldier ever even went in, over 100,000 soldiers were amassed and grouped to prepare for the attack. This was along with the mobilization of tanks and army vehicles. Think about that operation alone and how much it would have affected the environment. That's before any fighting even happens at all. So just the threat of war or the preparation for it is something that the world might not be able to handle that much more of. Moving over to the actual conflict though, how much can the world handle of that? Well, it really depends honestly. Conflict and Environment Observatory says, the environmental impacts of conflicts themselves vary greatly. Some international armed conflicts may be brief but highly destructive. Some civil wars may last for decades but be fought at low intensity. Many contemporary conflicts have blurred the lines, lasting years but with sustained periods of high-intensity warfare. Who is fighting, where they're fighting, and how they're fighting all strongly influence the environmental impact of a conflict. High-intensity conflicts require and consume vast quantities of fuel, leading to massive CO2 emissions and contributing to climate change. Large-scale vehicle movements can lead to widespread physical damage to sensitive landscapes and geodiversity, as can the intensive use of explosive ordnance. The use of explosive weapons in urban areas creates vast quantities of debris and rubble, which can cause air and soil pollution. Pollution can also be caused by damage to light industry and environmentally sensitive infrastructure such as water treatment plants. The loss of energy supplies can have reverberating effects that are detrimental to the environment, shutting down treatment plants or pumping systems, or can lead to the use of more polluting fuels or domestic generators. Now, they go on to write a bunch of stuff about other elements of warfare that we rarely even think about. Pollution elements such as gas leaks or energy plants getting blown up happens all the time. these incidents can't really be predicted and are super devastating to the environment when they do happen. Deforestation is a huge thing that goes on during war as well, where we see large forested areas just completely flattened by tanks and bombs. This is a true killer of the environment and something that sets the world back a ton as far as climate change goes. And also, let's think about human displacement. When there's a war going on, humans need to up and get out of there. Think about how many people are being forced to flee from their own country right now. That causes an environmental ripple effect that is ultimately super damaging. Basically, war is very costly on the environment and the earth. But here's what makes answering this question effectively impossible. We don't know how these wars will play out. Let's say that the people of Tuvalu, a very tiny island nation out in the Pacific, have a civil war. That is still a war and lives will still be lost, but the scale of the fight would be so tiny that the environmental impact would largely go unnoticed. If those are the wars that we're talking about, then the world can survive tons of those, thousands of tiny skirmishes like that. Scaling it up though, if we're talking about World War III scenarios where the United States and NATO is pitted against China and Russia and nukes get launched, well then it's possible that the Earth wouldn't be able to survive any wars because that war would completely kill it. There have been recent studies that suggest 100 warheads is kind of the imaginary line where if we pass it, then the world will be devastated beyond repair. In fact, it's believed that firing off 100 nukes would be so detrimental to society that whichever country fired them, they would actually feel the consequences in their own country as well, let alone which part of the world actually just got blown off the planet. So if World War III saw that many nukes fly, then it's night-night for the planet. The moral of this video is that war is very bad for the environment in all of its capacities. The larger it is, the more damaging it becomes. The current war is doing some serious damage to the environment and it's not even close to being over yet. I have no idea how many more wars of that size we'd be able to handle because we haven't been able to see the full scope of damage that it will cause. But either way, the answer probably isn't a lot. Wars aside, our practices in society have us at a turning point right now in regards to the environment. So basically, engaging in a bunch more wars that don't need to happen really isn't the best thing for the planet. How many countries are currently sinking? I hate that we have to make a video on this, guys, but this is the sad reality of the world right now. The word sinking is a tad bit misleading though, so let's clear some things up. Usually when we think of something sinking, we think that it's falling beneath the surface of a liquid. A boat, for instance, will become damaged, take on too much water, and then sink to the bottom of whatever body of water it is on. Oftentimes, we don't consider that something is sinking necessarily when the body of water that it is in rises and it doesn't. For the most part, that's what we're going to be looking at today though. Worldwide, ocean levels are rising to unprecedented heights. Land that used to comfortably sit above the water is now fully immersed in water that never used to be there. The land itself, again for the most part, isn't moving down, the water is just moving up. This is happening all over the place right now, and even though most of you watching this video aren't feeling the negative effects and ramifications of this, there definitely are people out there who are. But how many people are seeing this firsthand and watching as our world is slowly consumed by water? How many countries are currently sinking? Well, first off, let's figure out why this is happening. The short answer to that question is something that I'm sure all of you are very aware of at this point: climate change. Climate.gov says, global warming is causing global mean sea level to rise in two ways. First, glaciers and ice sheets worldwide are melting and adding water to the ocean. Second, the volume of the ocean is expanding as the water warms. A third, much smaller contributor to sea level rise is a decline in the amount of liquid water on land's aquifers, lakes and reservoirs, rivers, soil moisture. This shift of liquid water from land to ocean is largely due to groundwater pumping. Now they go on to say that, as global temperatures continue to warm, additional sea level rise is inevitable. How much much and by when depends mostly on the future rate of greenhouse gas emissions. But another source of uncertainty is whether big ice sheets in Antarctica and Greenland will melt in a steady, predictable way as the Earth gets warmer, or whether they will reach a tipping point and rapidly collapse. Every 4 or 5 years, NOAA leads an interagency task force that reviews the latest research on sea level rise and issues a report on likely and unlikely but plausible amounts future sea level rise for different greenhouse gas and global warming pathways. In the 2022 report, the task force concluded that even on the pathway with the lowest possible greenhouse gas emissions and warming, global mean sea level would rise at least 0.3 meters above 2000 levels by 2100. On a pathway with very high rates of emissions that trigger rapid ice sheet collapse, sea level could be as much as 2 meters higher in 2100 than it was in 2000. So this is a very real thing that is not only happening right now, but it's been happening and it will continue to happen in the future as well. I know that maybe 2 meters doesn't seem like a crazy amount, but when you think that this is going to happen worldwide, it really starts to get pretty scary. But if the worst possible case happened and all the ice melted in the world, then let's look at what that world would look like. This is a map of America if all of the ice around the world melted. Major cities would now be completely underwater, as well as hundreds of kilometers of land. New York, Houston, San Diego. We are talking about millions upon millions of people who now need to evacuate their homes and move to a totally new spot. This is just America as well. Moving over to Southern Asia, we can see that they too are going to be in deep waters, literally. Tokyo, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Mumbai, major cities that are completely underwater now with millions of people out of their homes. So ultimately, the answer to the question that we're asking, how many countries are currently sinking, is all of them. If you think about it, as the sea levels rise, even those furthest in the land are also sinking. However, you didn't click on this video to just hear that. You want to know which countries are currently sinking where the threat is imminent. Well, for the following list of countries, they could actually disappear completely off the face of the planet by 2100. Kiribati, the Maldives, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, the Solomon Islands, Samoa, Nauru, the Fiji Islands, and the Marshall Islands. The 9 islands that I just listed are all small island developing states. That's what they're classified as, and they will be the first victims of this rising sea level. Most of the islands that I listed there are located in the Pacific Ocean and are very far from other major land masses, making it very difficult for the people there. The nation of Tuvalu has already slowly started their evacuation process, moving the citizens over to New Zealand. It is simply a matter of time for these countries. The sea levels will eventually take them, we just don't know when that will happen. You could also make the argument that some bigger countries are sinking as well. The images we pulled up earlier showed what the world would look like if all the ice melted. But we also don't need to have all the ice melt to still have damaging impacts. The United States, for instance. We don't really think about them as sinking, however, Miami, Houston, and New Orleans are all massive cities with millions of people that are actually at a pretty real risk of sinking in the not so distant future. They are all regularly hit with floods, and those will only become more frequent as time goes on. Alexandria in Egypt, they are at severe risk of sinking because the Mediterranean Sea could rise a crazy amount in the coming century. Rotterdam in the Netherlands is a city where 90% of it is actually below sea levels. If the water gets high enough, then it will just funnel into the city and flood all of it. Bangkok in Thailand is another one that is actually a pretty unique example. Earlier in this video, I talked about how usually the conventional understanding of the word sinking has an object falling below liquid. Well, in this case, the city is actually falling. You see, Bangkok is a massive city with tons of people in it that just so happens to be built on soft clay. Simply put, Bangkok is so bloody heavy at this point that the clay is feeling the effects, and because it is soft clay, being pushed down. Considering the sea level is rising as well, Bangkok is on a horrible trajectory where it could be totally underwater by 2050. This is happening to a lot of the Southeastern Asian countries and the big cities that are there. The one that's on everyone's list right now that is in major trouble is Jakarta. Jakarta is a huge city in Indonesia that has over 10 million residents. In the last 10 years, parts of the city, specifically North Jakarta, have literally sunk 2.5 meters. That is a ridiculously scary statistic. They are another one where by 2050, things could totally be submerged and millions could be uprooted from their homes. This is happening right now, guys, and even though they aren't fully submerged yet, don't think for a second they aren't feeling the effects. If you look up Jakarta sinking on Google Images, you will see countless pictures of residents walking through the city with water literally up to their waist. There are tons of countries that are being affected by this right now, and even though it might seem like a cop-out, the correct answer for this question truly is all of the countries are currently sinking.
Nuclear blasts are deadly for a number of reasons. You got the initial blast impact, the heat, radiation, and the fallout. Today, let's see ways you could possibly survive a nuclear attack and fallout. Please don't use this as a guide though, I'm not a professional. Ready Government is an official website created by the American government to help its citizens prepare for a number of disasters, like tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, you name it. On the site, they have a section for what to do during a nuclear explosion. So according to the American government, the first step you should do is get inside. A brick or concrete building is the best. This is to avoid being exposed to the blast or any radiation. If you were outside after the fallout arrived, you have to remove contaminated clothing and wipe off or wash any skin that was exposed. Note that hand sanitizer does not work as a protectant against fallout. Same with disinfectant wipes. The next step is to get to the basement or middle of the building, but stay away from the outer walls and roof. Now, if you are out somewhere and not at home, try and find the nearest shelter if it's not too far away. There are mass care shelters for people to go to. These shelters have water, food, medicine, etc. But it means you'd be living with tons of people in a very confined space for a long period of time. The website continues on saying don't leave until the government then announces what you should do next. So that's reassuring. I guess what happens next depends on the severity of the situation and how close or far you are from the explosion. But most government websites say the same thing. Go inside, stay tuned. Now let's talk about nuclear fallout. The fallout is most dangerous in the first few hours after the detonation. That's when it gives off the highest levels of radiation. Fallout radiation decays relatively quickly with time. Most areas become fairly safe for travel and decontamination after 3 to 5 weeks. But that's 3 to 5 weeks of staying indoors and hoping you have enough food to last that long. It can affect the area though for 1 to 5 years. Now the fallout is basically radioactive dust and ash created when the nuclear weapon or bomb or whatever explodes. The amount and spread of the fallout is dependent on the size of the weapon and the altitude at which it was detonated at. So let's say the explosion happened close to where you are. Chances are the amount of radiation you would be exposed to would be lethal. Side effects from exposure to high levels of radiation includes hair loss, bleeding from the mouth, internal bleeding, ulcers, delirium, cancer, and you can even fall into a terminal coma. Death would follow in a couple of days. Let's take a look at the effects the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki had. After about a decade, survivors began suffering from thyroid, breast, lung, and other cancers at higher than normal rates. Along with this, pregnant women were at a high risk to miscarry or to give birth to a child born with birth defects or abnormalities. The children might also develop cancer later on in life. A total of 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 73,000 in Nagasaki died instantaneously or within 5 months due to the nuclear blast and its after effects. People within 1 kilometer of the bomb were carbonized by heat rays. Those 1.5 kilometers away suffered nasty skin burns. Their skin would then later fall off. Those inside buildings still were affected and burnt right to the bone, their flesh vaporized. Those that survived often suffered acute radiation sickness. Among the 100,000 or so survivors, the excess rates of cancer over the subsequent years were about 850 and leukemia less than 100. But again, this all depends on the size of the bomb. Apparently 1 megaton bomb, which is 80 times larger than the bomb detonated over Hiroshima, could affect people up to 13 miles or 20 kilometers away. Also, people would experience flash blindness. Even those 52 miles, which is 83 kilometers away, would experience this, and they would be temporarily blinded by the light. So back to surviving. Doesn't sound too pleasant if you end up surviving anyways, because the lasting effects can be devastating. The main thing is to stay indoors until it is safe to leave, so prepare now. Maybe we all should create a panic room or bunker. You may think that it's crazy, but it could be our best chance at staying alive and not getting sick afterwards. Underground bunkers are often prepped with food and water to last months. The food will be non-perishable things like canned food. Other things to have in there are blankets, candles, flashlights, and a first aid kit. The first aid kit is very, very important. If you get injured by the blast, it wouldn't be safe for you to just leave and go to a hospital. Plus, nurses and doctors wouldn't be working, they would be trying to survive. In Hiroshima, 90% of physicians and nurses were killed or injured, and 42 out of 45 hospitals were non-functional. People were left on their own fighting to survive. Another very important thing to have on deck is potassium iodine. Potassium iodine is said to block radioactive iodine from being absorbed by the thyroid gland, protecting yourself from radiation-related injuries. Having those on hand would help you immensely. Here's the thing though, let's say you did have an underground bunker. Well, if the blast is really bad, you might die in a firestorm as a result of the thermal radiation. This would consume most of the oxygen, meaning people who have managed to survive the bomb in underground bunkers would then be killed as all the oxygen is sucked out of the atmosphere. So isn't that reassuring? The last thing that I want to talk about is the whole idea that you could survive a nuclear blast by hiding in your fridge. We can thank Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull for that one, since it shows Indiana Jones surviving a blast by doing so. But it's unrealistic. For starters, the fridge would have to be lead lined. And where have you seen a lead lined fridge before? Hiding inside a refrigerator might shield you from the immediate thermal pulse, but then the firestorm again would melt the fridge and suck out all the oxygen from the fridge. Plus, how long after the blast could you realistically stay in that fridge for? That's before you struggle for air, become cold, or need water or food, because chances are food was taken out of the fridge in order for you to fit inside. Needless to say, don't hop in a fridge thinking it will shield you, protect you, and save your life. Again, I'm not a professional at this, I've just done my research, but I think we can all agree that a nuclear war or a bomb or explosion would have lasting, devastating effects.